Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the Fast Friday edition of the show for June 23rd, 2023. Thank you so much for being here. Unfortunately, we live under the largest government in history. That is true. But if we want to get to somewhere else, if we want a land of liberty, a true land of the free, that means there's a heck of a lot of stuff that needs to be, we'll say, nullified into oblivion, whether it's a government program or a general view, a prevailing view of the public at large. Now, these could probably change from week to week, but on this episode and for today, this is my top four. And I'm not going to necessarily go in any particular order, but I think a good one to start with is the Federal Reserve. We got to get rid of central banking. It is so dangerous to liberty, and it empowers this massive consolidated state that has nothing to do with the Constitution of the founders and the ratifiers. Here's an article that I've cited many times by Mike Maharrey, How the National Bank Destroyed the Limits of the Constitution. I should point out that the stuff that I'm mentioning, the articles, original source documents, and the like that I'm citing for this episode, I'm going to include in the show notes section. I publish a blog post for every episode about 1 to 2 hours after the live stream is done over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty, and you'll be able to find the show links section with the references there. But here's how Maharrey put it on the central bank. The Federal Reserve is the engine that drives the biggest, most powerful government in the history of the world. Monetary policy run through the Fed enables much of the U.S. government's excessive borrowing and spending. Think about that. All the programs, whether it's foreign or domestic, all the stuff that they're not supposed to be doing, but they keep doing anyway, all the stuff that people beg for even more, whether it's left or right or center, whatever it may be, they wouldn't be able to pull it off without the Federal Reserve. That's how Mike put it. He said, if the federal government had to rely on tax receipts and borrowing that it could actually repay, that's the key caveat, to fund all of its unconstitutional wars, foreign aid, and domestic spending, it would be dead in the water. The ability to raise revenue through taxation and free market borrowing, and of course, through real sound money as well, would naturally limit the government, Mike writes. But with the Fed backstopping the borrowing by monetizing the debt, there are virtually no limits on its spending, and then again, no limits on its size, scope, and eventually a tax on your liberty. Not eventually, but they get worse and worse and worse. So that's number one, nullify the central bank. Number two is more about a mentality of unlimited federal supremacy. Of course, there's issues with the supremacy clause itself, where people believe that federal law is always supreme all the time. That is a general prevailing view. But there's also an even worse one underlying this. A prevailing view, I think, of most people is that when they think the federal government has done something they're not authorized to do, when they believe that, well, maybe they violated the Constitution on this, in general, they ask the federal government if the federal government also thinks that the federal government violated the Constitution, and they tend to abide by whatever the federal government happens to decide. This is not a system where sovereignty resides in the people of the several states. Sovereignty meaning a final authority, and that's the system of the founders and the old revolutionaries. And Thomas Paine in The American Crisis, number one, in the winter of 1776, you know the phrase, these are the times that try men's souls. That's how he started this out. But he was also pointing out that one of the reasons they had to push on is because the British, under the Declaratory Act of 1766, they claimed unlimited power, unlimited supremacy over the colonies in, quote, all cases whatsoever. And here's how Paine put it. Again, I'll link to this in the show notes so you can read it in full, in context, on your own time. It's good stuff. Britain, with an army to enforce her tyranny, has declared that she has a right not only to tax, but to bind us in all cases whatsoever. And as we get close to Independence Day, it is important as a reminder that they weren't fighting a long, bloody war because they just wanted to have representation be in charge of their taxation. The taxation without representation was just an example of Britain claiming the power over them in all cases whatsoever. Just a quick side note. But Paine continues. He said, and if being bound in that manner is not slavery, then there is not such a thing as slavery upon earth. Even the expression is impious, for so unlimited a power can belong only to God. And Thomas Jefferson also hit on this pretty aggressively in his text of the Kentucky resolutions, which were passed on November 10th, 1798 against the hated Alien and Sedition Acts. And this is in the first paragraph. He said, the government created by this compact, talking about the Constitution, the government created by this compact was not made the exclusive or final judge of the extent of the powers delegated to itself. The government does not get to determine how much power the government gets to have under the Constitution. That's what Thomas Jefferson is telling us. He said that because of that, or in that situation, that would have made its discretion and not the Constitution the measure of its powers. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land, not the view of the federal government. So as long as people continue to believe that the federal government gets to determine how much power the federal government has, it doesn't matter which team is in charge. And that power is going to grow and grow and grow. We're already the largest government in history, but it can get even worse. So number 3 is all attacks. You got to nullify all attacks on our natural right of self-defense. Here's how Roger Sherman put it in debates in the House of Representatives in 1790. He said, "It is the privilege of every citizen and one of his most essential rights to bear arms and to resist every attack upon his liberty or property by whomsoever made." Of course, if you have a right of self-defense, and that Sherman is not holding back, that's what it means. Mercy Otis Warren described it this way: self-defense is a primary law of nature, which no subsequent law of society can abolish. And of course, it can only abolish it if the people allow it. But if the people decide to turn things around, then things will be turned around, even if it's difficult to get that job done. But of course, it relies on a people willing and able to do so. And so that's number 3. The last one I want to cover today is a party-first mentality on anything and everything. I mean, I see so many people and I discuss so many people, or I hear so many people talking about how everything has gotten partisan. Every issue, where you shop, what you think, what you watch, everything is always got a political message or a political aspect of this. And they wonder, well, how has it gotten so bad? Is it social media? They're the problem. We got to control them or something. There's always, if you don't understand the root of the problem, your solutions are always going to be wrong. But we should know, if people were better students of history, we would know that the reason for the hyper-partisanship on anything and everything is because we have a consolidated, centralized state, the largest government in the history of the world. The founders, the old revolutionaries, and the people they learned from warned us that the bigger and more consolidated the government, the more partisanship we would have all the time, and it would end in total tyranny. Here's how Thomas Gordon, one of the authors of Cato's letters in the early 18th century, put it in his Works of Sallust, 1744. He said, "It is with measures as with men. They are praised or condemned, not because they're right or wrong, beneficial or hurtful, but because they come from this party or the other. How many times do you see politicians flip-flop on one issue or another? Oh, I thought you were good on this for a while. And now all of a sudden you're terrible on it." And it really always kind of lines up with, it depends on which team is in power. And they flip-flop and switch and make excuses based on who's doing it. You could have 2 different teams doing virtually the exact same kind of thing when it comes to the Constitution, the structural things, the powers that they exercise. But people who support and oppose will switch teams or switch sides on that based on whether or not it's their team doing it or not. So Thomas Gordon understood this. This was influential on the founders. His writing was certainly influential on the founders as well. He said, "The best actions are decried as the worst if they arise from one quarter, the worst actions adored as the best if from the other." And I will link to that in the show notes so you can read it in full. It's a really good piece, this section of Works of Sallust on factions and a party-first mentality. But George Washington is far more famous in his views on this, but still being totally ignored by almost everyone today. Here in his farewell address, first drafted by James Madison in 1792, because he wanted out of office originally, although Thomas Jefferson and a few other people convinced him to stay, and also modified by Alexander Hamilton. But this was all under direction of Washington anyway. But here's how he put it: "The alternate domination of one faction or another sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. I mean, there is so much. We don't need anything more than that, but there is more. The alternate dominate, it sounds so familiar with what we live under today. We basically have a low-grade civil war every couple of years, every 4 years, with one side trying to destroy the other. They don't care what anybody says or does. They don't care if they look like they're inconsistent or liars. It doesn't matter. They just want to control the power. That's all they want. And people happily fall in line with this kind of absurdity, and they're creating their own frightful despotism. But frightful despotism wasn't the worst possible outcome to George Washington. He said this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. And if we're not there already, we are so close, it's almost hard to tell the difference. Here's how Noah Webster put it. He said, nothing is more dangerous. Nothing. The greatest danger to liberty, according to Noah Webster. Other people say that, it was close. It was one of the big ones. But Webster thought this was the worst one. Nothing is more dangerous to the cause of truth and liberty than a party spirit. A party-first mentality, he said, is death to liberty. Those are my top 4 of today, but I do want to take a brief moment before we head out for the weekend to say an extra big thank you. And in case you haven't heard me mention it a few times recently, but this weekend we're celebrating, or I guess commemorating is probably a better term, our 17-year anniversary here at the 10th Amendment Center. It's not really a celebration because honestly, if we were living in a land of liberty, if we had freedom, if the government was within the bounds of the Constitution, the 10th Amendment Center wouldn't exist. There'd be no reason for us to be here. So the fact that we're around and we're gaining steam and we're having so much impact is because things are bad. So on the positive end, we've been able to pull this off and do the things that we're doing with just a small team, a very small budget, etc., and with your support. But on the other hand, it's not good news because we have to keep doing so much more. But we are way, way ahead of anything as far as impact of what we do. Far more impact than I've ever imagined we ever would have. And I think as I zoom out and look at the big picture, we're still really just scratching the surface. So I really want to just give you an extra thanks for being here with us, whether you supported us financially, whether you are not able to do so, whether you've been with us for 10 years or 15 or 17 or 2 years or a week, or today's your first episode with this podcast, this show. It doesn't matter. I'm just so very grateful. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share this information with you, and I hope you enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed putting it together for you, and I hope that you'll be part of this movement in the years to come as we kick off our next 17 years. I don't know if 17 is going to be our milestone from now on, but thank you so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed this show. I hope you have a great weekend, and I hope to see you next week here on the path to liberty.